Nathan Ellison had not looked out a car window in years. Not really looked, the way you do when you have nothing, and the world outside feels like it belongs to someone else. These days, his eyes were always on a screen, always on numbers, always on the next meeting or the next deal that needed closing before noon. He was 41 years old, worth more money than most people could count, and his mornings looked nothing like they used to. His driver picked him up at 7 sharp every single day from a penthouse that overlooked the entire city of Chicago. And by the time Nathan settled into the back seat with his coffee and his phone buzzing with notifications, the world outside, the tinted glass was just a blur. Buildings, people, traffic, gray January sky, none of it meant anything to him anymore. He had worked too hard and climbed too far to still be moved by ordinary things. At least, that was what he told himself. That Tuesday morning started the same way every other morning did. His driver pulled out of the building's private garage. Nathan had 3 emails already open, and the city was doing what Chicago always does in January, punishing anyone who dared to be outside without a reason. The temperature had dropped overnight, the kind of cold that gets into your bones before you even realize it, and the sidewalks were mostly empty because sensible people were already indoors. Nathan wasn't thinking about any of that. He was thinking about a conference call he had at 9 and whether his team had prepared the right slides. Then the driver spoke. There was a road closure up ahead, some kind of water main issue, and they were going to have to go around through the park route, if that was okay. Nathan didn't even look up from his phone. He just said, fine, whatever gets us there. So, the car turned and the route changed, and that small, forgettable decision, a burst pipe somewhere beneath the street, became the thing that split Nathan's life into a before and an after. The park was quiet and mostly empty the way parks always are in deep winter. The trees had no leaves, the benches were dusted with frost, and the whole place had that cold, gray stillness to it that makes everything look like a photograph taken a long time ago. Nathan's driver slowed down because the path through was narrow, and there were a few people on the walking trail ahead. That was when Nathan, for no particular reason, lifted his eyes from his phone and looked out the window. He almost looked away. He almost went right back to his emails. But something stopped him, something about the shape of a woman sitting on a bench near the far edge of the path. A thin blanket pulled around her, and 2 small children pressed up against either side of her. The children were young, maybe 6 or 7, and they were huddled close to her the way kids do when they are cold and tired and don't fully understand why they're outside in the first place. The woman had her face turned slightly away from the road, looking down at the ground, and there was something about the way she was sitting, straight-backed, quiet, not defeated but deeply exhausted, that made Nathan's chest tighten before. His brain had even caught up with why. He didn't know it yet in that first second. He just felt it, the way you sometimes feel something before you can name it, like a sound you recognize from a long time ago, playing faintly in another room. The car moved a little closer, and the angle changed, and Nathan got a clearer look at her profile, the line of her jaw, the way she wore her hair, the particular stillness she always had even when everything around her was falling apart. And then his brain caught up. His hand went completely still over his phone. His coffee sat forgotten in the queue folder. The city, the emails, the 9 o'clock call, all of it just fell away in an instant, like someone had reached over and turned the volume down on his entire life. He knew that woman. He had once loved that woman more than he had ever loved anything, including the empire he built after she was gone. And those 2 small children sitting on either side of her, pressing their little hands together and blowing warm air into them against the January cold. They were twins. Nathan stared at them for what felt like a very long time. Then, in a voice that didn't sound quite like his own, he told his driver to stop the car. The driver pulled the car over without asking any questions, and Nathan just sat there for a moment with his hand on the door handle, not moving, not breathing properly, trying to understand what his eyes were telling him. 8 years. It had been 8 years since he had seen her face, and yet the moment he did, every single wall he had carefully built inside himself, every distraction, every achievement, every late night in the office he had used to bury the past, crumbled like they had never been there at all. He stepped out of the car into the biting cold and stood on the pavement. And while he was standing there, the years peeled back on their own, the way they do when something hits you hard. Enough, and suddenly he wasn't a billionaire in a $4,000 coat anymore. He was 33 again, broke, hopeful, and completely in love with a woman who believed in him before he believed in himself. Her name was Cassandra. He had met her at the kind of point in his life where everything was uncertain and nothing was guaranteed. He was working long shifts at a warehouse on the south side of Chicago, loading and unloading trucks for wages that barely covered rent. And she was a nursing student pulling double shifts at a diner 2 blocks from the hospital, where she trained. They met by accident, the way the best things in life usually happen, over a broken vending machine in the lobby of a tired little laundromat where they both happened to be doing their washing on the same rainy Wednesday night. She made a joke about it. He laughed. They ended up talking for 2 hours while their clothes spun in the machines, and by the time Nathan walked home that night, something in him had shifted in a way he couldn't explain. They were poor together, and there is a specific kind of closeness that comes from that, from splitting grocery bills and knowing exactly how much is in the account, and making each other laugh about it anyway, because what else are you going to do? Cassandra was the kind of woman who made a small life feel full. She wasn't chasing anything grand. She just wanted to become a nurse and take care of people and come home to someone who was genuinely glad to see her. And Nathan was genuinely glad to see her every single day, in the way that you are when someone makes the hard parts of life feel lighter just by being in the same room. He had ideas back then, big ones, the kind that kept him up at night scribbling in notebooks about building something of his own, a logistics company that could cut out the middlemen that were bleeding small businesses dry. Cassandra listened to every single one of those ideas without once telling him they were unrealistic. She sat across from him at their second-hand kitchen table with her nursing textbooks open and let him talk for hours. And when he was done, she would just say, quietly, that she thought he could do it. Nobody had ever said that to him before. When his first small business started gaining ground, just a little, just enough to feel real, the hours changed. The late nights got later. The missed dinners became regular. Nathan told himself it was temporary, that once things stabilized he would slow down. He would be present. He would get back to being the person she fell in love with. He kept moving the goalposts on that promise without realizing he was doing it. Then came the loss. Cassandra had been pregnant, and she lost the baby quietly. At a point when Nathan was in another city chasing a pitch meeting, he had decided not to cancel. She had called him that morning, and something in her voice told him she needed him to come home. And he almost did. He stood in that hotel corridor for a long moment with his phone in his hand. But he told himself she would be okay, that it was probably nothing, that the meeting was too important. It wasn't nothing. And he wasn't there. They never talked about it properly after that. Not really. And that silence hollowed something out between them that neither of them knew how to fill back in. Then about 4 months later, on a quiet evening when Nathan came home late and distracted, and already half somewhere else in his head, Cassandra told him she was pregnant again. Twins, the doctor had said. And instead of holding her, instead of feeling the joy that a different version of himself would have felt, Nathan felt pure panic, because his first real investor had just come through that week, and the timing felt impossible. and in one terrible moment of weakness and selfishness, he told her, plainly, that he wasn't ready for this. The look on her face when he said those words was something he had never been able to forget, no matter how many years he stacked on top of it. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. She just looked at him for a long, steady moment, the way she always did when she was deciding something, and then she nodded slowly, like he had just confirmed something she had been trying not to believe. She was gone within the week. She took almost nothing with her. She left no forwarding address. No angry messages, no demands. Just silence. And Nathan, standing now in the freezing January air of Millbrook Park, staring at the woman on that bench, understood with a clarity that hit him like a physical thing, that he had spent 8 years building an empire on top of a foundation of guilt, and that all it took was one wrong turn on a Tuesday morning to bring every single brick of it crashing down. Nathan walked toward the bench slowly. The way you approach something you're afraid might disappear if you move too fast. The cold hit him properly now that he was out of the car. Sharp and mean the way Chicago cold always is in January. But he barely felt it. His eyes were fixed on Cassandra, and she was still looking down, still holding that thin blanket around herself and the 2 children. And for a few seconds that felt much longer than they were, he just stood a few feet away, not knowing what to say, not knowing if any words he had were good enough for this moment. Then she looked up, and the expression that crossed her face was not what he expected. He had half prepared himself for anger, or tears, or some version of the confrontation they never had 8 years ago. What he got instead was something quieter and somehow harder to look at. Her eyes registered him, recognized him completely, and then went very still, like a door closing gently but firmly. She wasn't surprised. She wasn't broken. She was just guarded, in the way that people get when life has taught them that being open costs too much. She pulled the blanket a little tighter around the children and lifted her chin slightly, and Nathan felt the full weight of who she had become without him. Someone who had learned to protect herself, and who was doing it right now in real time, sitting on a freezing park bench with 2 small children and not a single trace of self-pity on her face. He said her name. She said his. That was all for a moment. Then he sat down on the edge of the bench, not close, not presuming anything, just close enough to talk, and he asked her, as simply as he could manage, if she was okay. The look she gave him in response to that question was brief, but it said everything. The kind of look that means we both know the answer to that, so let's not pretend. She told him they were fine. He looked at the children, and they looked back at him with the wide, honest curiosity that kids have before the world teaches them to be suspicious of strangers. They were a boy and a girl. They looked almost identical, in the way that twins sometimes do. Same eyes, same shape to their faces, same instinct to lean slightly toward their mother whenever something felt uncertain. Nathan's chest did something that he didn't have a name for in that moment. He looked at Cassandra, and she met his eyes and didn't look away. And no words were needed for what passed between them in that second, because the math was simple and they both knew it. He didn't ask out loud. She didn't confirm out loud. Not yet. Instead, she told him, in that same quiet and steady voice he remembered, what the last 6 months had looked like. She had been a qualified nurse for 4 years. She said, working at a hospital on the north side, building something solid and real on her own. Then the downsizing came. Budget cuts, restructuring, a whole war closed, and her position was gone along with dozens of others. She had savings, but they went fast the way savings always do when there's no income coming in, and 2 children depending on you for everything. Her sister, the one person who had been her support system through all of it, had relocated abroad for her husband's work 8 months ago. The apartment lease ended, and she couldn't make the new terms work on what she had left. She had been navigating the shelter system for weeks, she said. But the shelters were full. Genuinely. Completely full. The kind of full where they apologize and hand you a list of other numbers to try. The previous night, the temperature had dropped faster than anyone predicted, and she had been trying to get the children to a warming center across the city, but the bus had been delayed, and by the time everything fell apart, it was late and dark. And the bench was what there was. She said all of this without drama, without asking for anything, without once dropping that composed and steady way of carrying herself that Nathan had always admired and apparently never deserved. She wasn't telling him because she wanted his help. She was telling him because he had asked, and she had nothing left to spend on pretending. Nathan sat there listening and didn't say a word until she was finished. And when she was done, he looked at the children again. The little boy had fallen half asleep against Cassandra's arm, and the girl was watching Nathan with those calm, curious eyes. And something shifted in Nathan that had nothing to do with guilt or money or the past. It was something older and simpler than any of that. He stood up from the bench and looked at Cassandra and said, quietly, that he was not going to make a phone call and send someone. He said he was going to take them somewhere warm himself right now, and that she didn't have to agree to anything beyond that, and that he was not going to make this about him or about what happened between them. Cassandra looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for the angle, for the thing he wanted in return, the way you do when life has taught you that offers come with conditions. He held her gaze and didn't flinch and didn't add anything. And after a moment, she reached down and gently woke the boy and got them both to their feet, and she nodded once, not warmly, not gratefully, just practically. And that single nod felt to Nathan like the most honest and costly thing anyone had ever given him. Nathan drove them himself. He told his driver to take the rest of the day off, and he put Cassandra and the children in the front and back of the car and drove to a hotel that was warm and quiet and decent without being the kind of place that would make her feel like he was showing off. He didn't take them to the penthouse. He didn't call ahead to have someone prepare anything elaborate. He just drove, and the children sat in the back seat and looked out the window at the city, the way children do when everything is new. And Cassandra sat in the passenger seat and looked straight ahead and didn't say much. And Nathan kept his eyes on the road and let the silence be what it was. At the hotel, he checked them into a suite with 2 rooms and made sure there was food ordered before. He even sat down because the children hadn't eaten properly, and that was the only thing that mattered in the first hour. He watched the little girl eat with the focused seriousness that hungry children have, and the boy kept glancing at him sideways between bites, not with hostility, just with that careful, measuring look that kids get when they're trying to figure out where a new person fits. Nathan didn't try to charm them or win them over. He just sat at the far end of the table and let them eat and breathe through the tightness in his chest and waited. Later, after both children had fallen asleep in the inner room with the television on low, Nathan and Cassandra sat across from each other at a small table near the window. And for the first time in 8 years, they were just 2 people in a room with the truth between them and nowhere to put it except on the table. She spoke first. She told him what those years had actually looked like. Not the summary version she gave him on the bench, but the real version. The delivery room where she held both babies alone because there was no one else. Where a nurse she had never met before held her hand because that was the only hand available. She told him about the first year, which was the hardest year of her life. Harder than anything she had imagined, and how she got through it on stubbornness and the particular kind of love you feel for a child that makes you get up, even when getting up feels impossible. She told him about the birthdays and the small milestones and the questions. The boy started asking around age 5 about why his family looked different from other families, and how she answered those questions as honestly as she could for his age without making him carry weight he wasn't ready for. She told him all of it in that same level, composed voice, not to punish him, not to perform her suffering, but simply because it was the truth, and she was done spending energy on softening it for other people's comfort. Nathan listened. He did not interrupt. He did not explain himself or defend the choices he made back then, or try to reframe anything in a way that made him look better. He had spent a long time being very good at managing how things sounded, at choosing words that controlled the shape of a story, and he made a conscious decision in that hotel room to not do any of that. He just sat there and let her words land exactly as heavy as they were meant to land, and he absorbed every single one of them without flinching away. When she was done, the room was quiet for a while. Then he said, simply and without any dressing around it, that he had been a coward. Not that the timing was bad, or that he was young, or that the pressure he was under was real, all of which was true, but that when it came to the moment that actually counted, he chose himself, and that was the truth of it, and he was sorry in a way that he knew no apology could fix. Cassandra looked at him when he said that, and something in her face shifted slightly, not softening exactly, but recognizing. Like she had been waiting a long time to hear someone say the plain version instead of the managed version. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that stayed with Nathan long after that night was over. She said she had made her peace with raising the children alone, and that she wasn't sitting across from him looking for an apology or a rescue or a second chapter to a story she had already finished writing without him. But then she leaned forward. Slightly, and her voice dropped just a little, and she said that the children were the conversation that actually needed to happen, that the boy was starting to ask harder questions now, the kind that a mother's love alone couldn't fully answer, and that whatever Nathan decided to do or not do going forward, the children deserved to know the truth about who their father was. She said it without anger and without ultimatum. She said it the way she said most things, straight, clean, and completely without performance. And Nathan felt something happen in him that was different from guilt, different from grief, different from the complicated shame he had been carrying for years. It was something clearer than all of that. He looked at her across the table, and he said that he didn't want to write a check and disappear again. He said he understood he had no right to walk back into their lives and claim anything. But he said he wanted to try to be present, not as someone who showed up with money and grand gestures, but as a father, the way that word actually means something, the way it requires you to show up on ordinary days and be consistent and boring and reliable and there. Cassandra didn't smile, and she didn't tell him that was wonderful. She looked at him steadily and said that she would not be the one to decide that the children would lead it at their own pace, and that if he disappeared again or made it about his own feelings or couldn't handle the slowness of earning trust from two small people who didn't owe him anything, then this conversation would be the last one they ever had. Nathan nodded. He meant it. 6 months is not a long time when you are trying to rebuild something that took years to break, and Nathan knew that better than anyone. He didn't walk out of that hotel room thinking the hard part was over. If anything, sitting across from Cassandra that night had made him understand that the hard part was just beginning, and that this particular kind of hard was different from every difficult thing he had faced in business, because there was no strategy for it, no metric to track, no moment where you close the deal and shake hands and call it done. This was slower than that. This was quieter than that. And for a man who had spent the better part of a decade measuring his worth in outcomes and numbers and things he could point to, learning to exist in that slowness was the most uncomfortable thing he had ever done. He started small because small was all he was allowed, and he respected that completely. The first few visits were short and careful. An hour at a park, a Saturday afternoon at a small indoor play space where the children could move around, and he could simply be nearby without any pressure attached to it. The boy was cautious around him in the beginning, polite in that particular way that children are when they've been taught good manners, but haven't yet decided if they like you. He would answer Nathan's questions with short, complete sentences and then go back to whatever he was doing, and Nathan didn't push, didn't try to buy his way into the boy's good graces with toys or grand days out. Just showed up and was present, and let the child set the pace entirely. The girl was different. She had a directness to her that reminded Nathan so much of Cassandra that had made his throat tighten the first time she turned to him out of nowhere during their second visit, and asked him, completely matter-of-factly, why he hadn't been around before. Nathan had thought about how he might answer that question someday, had rehearsed versions of it in his head, but when it came from a 7-year-old looking at him with those clear, patient eyes, every rehearsed version dissolved, and he just told her the truth in the simplest words he had, that he had made a bad choice a long time ago, that it had hurt people he cared about, and that he was trying very hard now to be better. She looked at him for a moment and then nodded and went back to her drawing, and that was that. Children have a way of accepting honest answers that adults never quite manage, and Nathan held on to that moment for a long time afterward. Cassandra watched all of it from a careful distance, the way a person does when they are not yet sure whether to trust what they are seeing. She was not cold toward him, but she was not warm either. She was measured, which was fair, which was exactly what the situation deserved. They communicated mostly about the children, about schedules and small practical things, and Nathan made sure never to confuse those conversations with something they weren't. He was not trying to get back what they had. He understood, with a clarity he wished he'd had at 33, that Cassandra was not a chapter in his redemption story. She was a person who had built a whole life in the years he had wasted. And she didn't owe him a single thing, least of all the role of being the woman who forgave him. What he owed her was consistency, and that was what he gave. He also did something that nobody knew about for a long time. He had learned through a conversation with a shelter coordinator that Cassandra had dealt with during her worst weeks, that the system she had fallen through was not unusual, that hundreds of mothers and children in Chicago every single winter ended up in gaps that the existing shelters simply couldn't cover, not because nobody cared, but because the capacity wasn't there. Nathan quietly funded an expansion. He didn't attach his name to it. He didn't issue a statement or invite press coverage or find a way to work it into his public profile. He just made sure the money was there and the beds were there, and that. The next woman who called at 11 at night with 2 children and nowhere to go would get a different answer than Cassandra got. One evening near the end of those 6 months, Nathan drove past Millbrook Park on his way home, not by accident. This time, on purpose, and he pulled over and got out and walked to that bench and sat down on it alone. The park was quiet. The trees were just beginning to show the first small signs of something returning after a long winter, the way they always do when you're almost done waiting. He sat there in the cold for a while and thought about burst pipes, and wrong turns and the strange, painful mercy of being forced to look out a window at exactly the right moment. He thought about 2 small children blowing warm air into their frozen hands, and a woman sitting straight-backed and undefeated in the cold, and every choice that had led to that bench, and every choice that had led away from it. He didn't feel sorry for himself sitting there. He felt something more honest than that, a deep, settled sense of accountability, the kind that doesn't need an audience, the kind that just sits with you quietly and asks you every single day to be better than you were yesterday. He placed his hand on the cold iron armrest, stayed there until the feeling was fully in him, and then he stood up, walked back to his car, and drove home to prepare for the weekend visit, which was in 2 days, which was something he had not once rescheduled, and which he was not going to start now.
The end. Thanks for watching my video. subscribe my channel Velmorith Crown. Like, subscribe and share.